Did you know about Henry Johnson? A World War I hero whose courage stunned an entire battlefield yet vanished from American memory. How does a man who single-handedly fought off a German raid, saved his fellow soldier while bleeding from multiple wounds, and earned France's highest battlefield honor return home to silence instead of gratitude? Why did France parade him as a hero while America stripped him of recognition, medals, and dignity? Who decided that his bravery was inconvenient, his skin color unacceptable, and his story better left untold? Was this forgetfulness? Accidental? Deliberate? Why were official records buried, recommendations ignored, and his family left to carry the weight of a stolen legacy for generations? What does it say about a nation that praises freedom abroad but withholds honor at home? And how many other heroes like Henry Johnson were erased, simply because acknowledging them would expose an uncomfortable truth? Stay with us, because this is not just a story of war. It is a story of betrayal, silence, and a hero history tried to erase. The night in the Argonne forest was thick with fog and fear. It was May 1918. No moon, no warning. Only silencent, it shuddered. Two American sentries stood watch in a shallow trench carved into the French earth. One of them was Private Henry Johnson. The other, Needham Roberts, barely had time to breathe before shadows moved through the wire. German soldiers surged forward, their bayonets glinting in the darkness. Grenades exploded, ripping through the quiet like thunder. Roberts fell, badly wounded, screaming for help. Johnson didn't retreat. He didn't wait for orders. He charged. With his rifle, he fired until the weapon jammed. When bullets ran out, he hurled grenades into the advancing enemy. When grenades were gone, he used the butt of his rifle until it shattered. Bleeding from over 20 wounds, Johnson drew his knife and fought hand-to-hand in the mud and smoke, slashing, striking, refusing to surrender. The enemy retreated. The trench held out by dawn. The forest was silent again. Johnson collapsed beside Roberts, his uniform soaked in blood, his body barely alive. He had saved his fellow soldier. He had held the line alone. In that darkness, Henry Johnson became a legend. But when the sun rose, America would begin to forget. Henry Johnson stood against odds that should have meant certain death. He was one man outnumbered, outgunned, and cut off in the darkness of the Argonne forest. The German raiding party moved with trained precision, dozens strong-armed with rifles, grenades, and bayonets. Johnson had none of that advantage. He had a single rifle, a few grenades, a bolo knife at his side. His will to survive. When the attack began, his rifle became his lifeline. He fired again and again, holding the line while enemy silhouettes closed in. Then the rifle jammed. For most soldiers, that would have been the end. For Johnson, it was only the beginning. He threw grenades until his supply was gone, explosions tearing through the darkness, buying precious seconds. Wounded, repeatedly shot, slashed, bleeding Johnson refused to fall. When his rifle broke, he reached for his bolo knife and met the enemy face to face. Steel clashed in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Each step forward was powered by desperation, loyalty to his wounded comrade, and raw determination. There were no reinforcements, no backup, no escape. Yet the enemy retreated against impossible odds, armed with little more than grit and courage. Henry Johnson did what history claimed was impossible. He survived, and he won. When the smoke cleared and the truth of that night reached French command, there was no hesitation. Henry Johnson's bravery was undeniable. Johnson was carried from the front lines, his body torn by more than 20 wounds. Yet, even as he recovered, his story spread quickly through French units. Soldiers spoke his name with respect. Officers saluted him not out of formality, but admiration. In France, Valor was Valor, and Henry Johnson had earned it in full. The French military awarded him the Croix de Guerre with star and palm, one of the nation's highest decorations for battlefield heroism. It was not symbolic. It was immediate. It was public. Johnson became one of the first American soldiers of the war to receive the honor, and the first Black American so recognized. France called him a hero. They celebrated him as a warrior who had held the line when all seemed lost. Across the ocean, however, a very different silence was already forming. In France, Henry Johnson's name was spoken with pride. His wounds were treated as proof of valor, his actions recorded as legend. But when his story crossed the Atlantic, something changed. The U.S. Army responded not with applause, but with distance. Reports were softened. Language was diluted. What France called heroism, America labeled exaggeration. Johnson was praised in vague terms, but denied the highest honors. There was no parade, no ceremony, no full acknowledgement of the facts witnessed on the battlefield. His wounds did not translate into medals. His courage did not translate into promotion. Behind the silence was an uncomfortable reality. Henry Johnson was a black soldier in a segregated army, one that often refused to admit black men could fight with distinction. Celebrating him fully would challenge a system built on exclusion and prejudice. So his story was pushed aside. His name faded from official records. While France lifted him up as a symbol of bravery, the United States quietly looked away. The same battlefield, to some a hero, to nations aunt, two very different truths. Henry Johnson's erasure cannot be separated from the reality of the unit. He served in the 369th Infantry Regiment, better known as the Harlem Hellfighters. Racial prejudice shaped every aspect of their service. The U.S. Army circulated warnings to French forces, urging them not to treat black American soldiers as equals. Even before combat, the Hellfighters were viewed not as warriors, but as a problem to be managed. Yet when the regiment was placed under French command, everything changed. The Hellfighters fought longer on the front lines than any other American unit. They held their ground, earned respect, and proved again and again that the prejudice against them was baseless. Despite this, recognition at home remained limited. Their victories were minimized, their heroism treated as inconvenient. Acknowledging their achievements would have challenged the segregation that defined American military policy. So, while the Harlem Hellfighters became legends in France, in America they were allowed to return home quite brave men, confined by the same barriers they had shattered in war. When Henry Johnson returned from France, his story should have dominated American headlines. The facts were undeniable. A lone soldier, wounded repeatedly, holding off a German raid, and saving a fellow American's life. Yet the early American media treated his heroism cautiously. Sometimes vaguely, often incompletely, and never with the weight it deserved. Newspapers mentioned Johnson, but rarely told the full story. His actions were softened into brief battlefield anecdotes, stripped of detail and urgency. The brutality of the fight, the overwhelming odds, and the hand-to-hand combat that shocked French officers were often reduced to polite summaries. Some outlets avoided naming him altogether, choosing instead to praise the regiment in general terms. This restraint was not accidental. Celebrating Johnson fully would have forced the public to confront an uncomfortable truth. A black soldier had displayed extraordinary courage in a segregated army that officially questioned black combat ability. Media narratives at the time often reinforced existing racial hierarchies rather than challenged them. As a result, Johnson became a hero without a platform. His name lacked repetition. His image lacked prominence. His sacrifice lacked permanence in the public mind. While France told his story loudly and clearly, America whispered it until even the whispers began to fade. After the guns fell silent, Henry Johnson returned home not as a celebrated hero, but as a man battered by war and abandoned by his own country. His body bore the scars of more than 20 wounds, gunshots, bayonet slashes, and deep lacerations. But the U.S. government offered little more than bureaucratic indifference. Medical care was minimal, pensions were delayed, and support for his long-term recovery was practically non-existent. Poverty quickly followed. Johnson struggled to find steady work, his body weakened and his hands permanently damaged from combat. Jobs that required physical labor were nearly impossible, and opportunities for advancement were scarce for a black veteran in a segregated, discriminatory society. Every day was a battle a different kind from the one in the Argonne forest. even as newspapers occasionally recounted his bravery abroad. Recognition did not translate into financial security or societal respect. He fought on foreign soil for freedom and honor, only to face neglect at home. The very nation he had risked everything to protect offered him nothing but silence and bureaucratic hurdles. Henry Johnson survived the impossible odds of war, only to endure another kind of struggle in peace, one against poverty, neglect, and a society unwilling to honor its heroes. Systemic racism pervaded every aspect of the U.S. military and government bureaucracy, creating nearly insurmountable obstacles for black soldiers seeking pensions or medical care. Applications for disability pensions were routinely delayed, lost, or denied outright. Black veterans often had to provide extensive documentation of their injuries, proof that was difficult to obtain after service in segregated units, and event-in claims were frequently dismissed. Hospitals and veterans' facilities were segregated, underfunded, or simply inaccessible to black soldiers. Many suffered from permanent war injuries, psychological trauma, and chronic pain, yet received little to no treatment. The discrimination was not only procedural but cultural. Officials assumed black veterans were less deserving of support, echoing the same prejudices that had limited their combat roles during the war. Local and state authorities often compounded these barriers, slowing or blocking access to already meager federal aid. As a result, many heroes, men like Henry Johnson and his comrades, and the Harlem Hellfighters, returned to poverty, struggling to survive with bodies broken in service to a country that denied them care. Their valor abroad did not protect them from systemic injustice at home, leaving a legacy of courage overshadowed by neglect and inequality. France celebrated Henry Johnson instantly, public medals, ceremonies, and soldier-to-soldier respect because French commanders judged bravery on merit, not skin. That external embrace preserved his name and gave him honor when homegrown recognition was stifled. In the United States, by contrast, institutional racism, military segregation, and a press unwilling to challenge social hierarchies flattened the story. Reports were muted, recommendations stalled, and honors withheld. Celebrating a black man's battlefield heroism threatened the comfortable narratives of white supremacy that shaped policy and public opinion, so silence became the default response. The result was bitterly ironic. The nation he risked his life to defend treated him as expendable, while a foreign army made him a symbol of valor. This mismatch robbed Johnson and his family of immediate support, delayed official vindication for decades, and left a national stanan argument that courage should be honored everywhere, not only where it is convenient. Henry Johnson's journey to recognition in the United States was long, painful, and emblematic of the racial injustices that obscured black soldiers' contributions for decades. After his return from World War I, he lived in relative obscurity, battling poverty and war injuries, while France celebrated him as a hero. In America, his name barely appeared in newspapers, and official honors were withheld. For decades, government inaction and systemic racism kept his story buried. It wasn't until the late 20th century that historians, veterans advocates, and Johnson's family began pushing for acknowledgement. Scholars documented his actions, comparing them to official reports, French citations, and eyewitness accounts. Congressional hearings were held. Bills were introduced to award him the Medal of Honor, though progress was slow, often stalling amid political inertia. Finally, in 1996, decades after his death, Johnson was posthumously awarded the Purple Heart and the Distinguished Service Cross, though many still argued these honors were insufficient. The campaign continued, fueled by public awareness and media coverage, highlighting both his heroism and the injustice of prior neglect. In 2015, over a century after his heroic stand in the Argonne forest, Henry Johnson received the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military award. This belated recognition symbolized not only his courage, but the slow, painstaking effort required to confront historical prejudice and honor black veterans who had long been denied their rightful place in American memory. Henry Johnson's heroism might have remained forgotten if not for the relentless efforts of advocates, historians, and military families determined to tell the truth. For decades, his name was absent from official records, overshadowed by racial prejudice and bureaucratic neglect. It was only through the dedication of researchers and activists that his story began to resurface. Historians meticulously pieced together battlefield reports, French citations, and eyewitness accounts, showing that Johnson's actions were not legend but documented fact. Veterans organizations, civil rights advocates, and military historians lobbied Congress, wrote articles, and organized public campaigns to pressure the government to recognize a man who had risked everything for his country. They held forums, spoke to lawmakers, and ensured that Johnson's contributions could no longer be ignored. Military families also played a crucial role. Descendants and relatives carried his story forward, sharing personal letters, family memories, and oral histories that illustrated the human cost of war and the injustice of neglect. Their persistence humanized the hero behind the medals and statistics, making it impossible for officials to dismiss him. Together, this coalition of voices created an unstoppable push for justice. Their efforts culminated in posthumous honors, including the Purple Heart, the Distinguished Service Cross, and finally the Medal of Honor in 2015, ensuring Henry Johnson's courage could never again be erased from history. Decades after the guns fell silent in the Argonne forest, Henry Johnson's valor was finally recognized by the United States, albeit posthumously. For nearly a century, the soldier who had fought alone against overwhelming odds, earning the admiration of French commanders and soldiers alike, remained largely forgotten at home. His story, buried under layers of racial prejudice and bureaucratic neglect, was finally brought back into the light by historians, advocates, and his family. In 1996, Johnson was awarded the Purple Heart, acknowledging the severe wounds he had suffered while defending Needham Roberts and holding off a German raid. That honor, though belated, symbolized the first official recognition of his sacrifices by his own country. Yet, many argued that a medal recognizing bravery in the highest sense, the nation's most prestigious award, was long overdue. After years of persistent advocacy and legislative efforts, in 2015, President Barack Obama posthumously awarded Henry Johnson the Medal of Honor, the United States' highest military decoration. The award cited his extraordinary heroism under fire, his unwavering courage, and his refusal to surrender despite injuries and overwhelming odds. These posthumous awards finally cemented Johnson's place in American history not as a footnote, but as a true hero. After decades of neglect, the world could no longer ignore the man who had fought alone, bravely, and victoriously. Henry Johnson's story endures not merely as a tale of battlefield heroism, but as a timeless testament to courage, resilience, and moral strength in the face of overwhelming adversity. Alone in the darkness of the Argonne forest, facing dozens of German soldiers armed with rifles, grenades, and bayonets, Johnson refused to yield. With only a rifle, a bolo knife, and sheer determination, he protected his comrade and held the line, defying odds that would have crushed most men. His bravery was recognized instantly by the French, yet ignored by his own country, highlighting the additional battle he would face against systemic racism and neglect. Decades later, posthumous honors such as the Purple Heart and the Medal of Honor finally acknowledged his sacrifices, but the true power of Johnson's story lies beyond medals. It is a story that speaks to the human capacity for courage under extreme pressure, the strength to fight not just enemies in battle but injustice and indifference at home. It inspires generations to confront challenges with determination, to act with integrity even when unrecognized, and to honor the unsung heroes whose contributions shape history quietly yet profoundly. Henry Johnson's legacy reminds us that true heroism is measured not only by victories in war but by the unwavering spirit to confront adversity alone, steadfast and unbroken. Henry Johnson's life exposes some of the most uncomfortable truths about American history. The persistence of racial injustice, the selective nature of military recognition, and the ways in which systemic prejudice shapes who is remembered and who is forgotten. Here was a man who risked his life on foreign soil, single-handedly holding off a German raid, saving a fellow soldier, and earning France's highest honors, yet his own country largely ignored him. His story reveals that valor alone was not enough to guarantee respect or acknowledgement in an America where segregation and racial bias were entrenched. Even within the military, the U.S. Army's slow and minimal recognition, coupled with decades of bureaucratic obstacles for pensions and medical care, demonstrates how black soldiers' contributions were often minimized or erased. Johnson's post-war poverty and neglect highlight the nation's failure to care for those who sacrificed the most. Meanwhile, France celebrated him without hesitation, showing that the injustice was not a matter of bravery, but of systemic discrimination. Johnson's experience forces Americans to confront a dual reality. The country's commitment to freedom abroad did not extend equally to its black citizens at home, and the historical record itself is shaped by who is deemed worthy of remembrance. His story is a reminder that heroism can be universal, but recognition often is not. Henry Johnson's story reminds us that true heroism can be ignored, and history can be shaped by prejudice. Remembering overlooked heroes is not just honoring the past, it is a commitment to justice, inclusivity, and truth. Every soldier who fought bravely, yet remained unrecognized, deserves their place in our collective memory. By telling these stories, we ensure that courage is celebrated, regardless of race, background, or circumstance. Subscribe to Voices from World War II and join us in uncovering the forgotten voices of history, giving heroes like Henry Johnson the recognition they were long denied.